All right, everybody. Today we are going to review a bit of everything that we covered in the class so far in preparation for our final quiz. Um, in advance, please excuse any baby cooing and cawing in the background. I'm trying to keep it quiet. So we're going to get started by first talking about the web design process. So pulling this up from a couple different lectures we're going to go through, just to review pretty much everything that we've done so far. So I wanted to make sure that the process of how you get from an idea of a website into a functional website in Dreamweaver is clear. And broadly, we went through, creating content, laying things out in Photoshop, preparing and exporting our assets for the web, and then building and coding everything in Dreamweaver. And so this kind of follows the main web design stages and assets that we make. So whether we are creating these or being provided these, every website is going to start with some sort of concept or idea that will be represented with a brand or a mood board, some sort of assets that are going to guide your design of the website itself. The wireframes are next. They are completely devoid of theme or brand or aesthetic. They're all about function. So the wireframes, again, illustrate exactly what will be on the page. Here we've got a few more things in here. So yeah, really just the functionality. What information is going to be on the page? How will it be structured and laid out? What will the user journey experience be? How will somebody know how to get from point A to B to C? We made some wireframes, and yeah, again, we are basing these on mood boards, brands. You should be familiar with what these are, broadly speaking, and what they consist of, and how we use them in our projects. So we did wireframes. Then we moved on to Photoshop mockups, which are pretty much taking the wireframes and applying the brand to the mockups. So adding color, adding type, adding look and feel, like layout and images, to the point where we have a pixel-perfect mockup of what our website's going to look like. Obviously, it's not going to stay exactly this way, but this is, like every step in the process before, meant to guide us and make our decisions easier in the next step as we start to code and create our website in Dreamweaver. This is the point that we were spending a lot of time on, building our HTML and our CSS drafts. You can often think about this as prototyping. When you're making a website in a professional context, it's rare that it's ever done, and it's more a cycle of continuing to redo and continuing to improve. So prototyping is often thought of as creating test cases that you can use to prototype the user journey and test with users. But it's also really just the process of creating and maintaining and updating websites over time. And this is what we were doing in Dreamweaver by building our websites. So outside of the web design process, next up, we've got some of the basic HTML and CSS terms and functions, as well as structures. So the most basic unit, well, I guess before even the units, there is being clear on what is HTML and what is CSS. HTML is the content and the structure. So that is, adding the text of the website, adding the images, but not really the look and feel, the layout, the style. That is CSS. So let's see, we've got, and we'll get into more detail in a second. The CSS is going to be the color, the look and feel, the fonts, the layout, polishing the visual approach, whereas the HTML is really just, the sections of the page with the content in them. You should be familiar with what a tag is. So we use a lot of different types of tags, and a tag is basically any of these pieces of code that start and end with a caret. And there is an opening tag, and there is a closing tag. In this case, A is for a link, so anything between this opening and closing tag would be wrapped by a link. Similar in here, we've got H1, opening an H1 text, a header, and then closing the tags. So just the basic structure of tags, open and close, and then wrap pieces of content to apply different functions and styles to them. Some HTML structure to be aware of, every document is going to have a head that is the metadata information that is not visibly shown on the website, but is used by search engines and computers to learn about the website. So in this document, we have a very simple head that just has the title of the website, and this is where the title will show up on the top of the tab when you're loading it in a browser. But often websites would have a lot more information in the head, including meta information like a description that would populate your Google search result. Really anything that was going to be up in the head of the document is going to be ahead of all of the body or all of the real content of the page and is not going to be shown on the page itself. Then there's the body, which contains, everything that's going to be on your page. Some basic HTML tags to be aware of are text styling. So these are presets and sizes that apply different combinations of size and bold to pieces of text. The smallest and most normal text is just a paragraph text with a P. And then we have headings that are H1 through H6, with 1 being the biggest and 6 being the smallest. These are predefined in HTML. We don't need any CSS to change the style for these. Talking about CSS a little bit, though, we've got a couple of terms to be aware of: selectors, properties, and values. So selectors are the code that is used to select the HTML elements that you want to use. These are the links that we create from the HTML and to the CSS so that the CSS is applied to the proper HTML code. Often these selectors are classes or IDs. This is code in the HTML where you would define something. Let's see, we've got an example on here. No. A lot of the ones that we were using would say, div class equals, yada yada. And there would be a lot of classes that would be predefined by Bootstrap. There would be classes that you could customize and make yourself. Classes and IDs are just used in HTML to become selectors pretty much. So all selectors are either going to be a standard HTML element like an H1 or the body, or a class that you are customizing and specifying in your HTML. The property then is what part of that object do you want to change. So if the selector is H1, the property is what is the font family, what is the font size, what is the color. And the value is what we're defining for each of those properties. So our selector as H1 would be defining the property of font family as Arial or sans serif. And that's pretty much all we need to know for the structure and HTML functions and CSS functions. So the only other thing to talk about here in terms of CSS is how we link to or reference our CSS documents. There are 3 different ways that we can relate to CSS, and that is embedded, linking, or remote. So embedded would be having the CSS within our HTML document, not having a separate CSS file, but putting the CSS properties within the style section up in the head of the document. And this document doesn't have a style section, but it would be up in the head, just putting a little bit of CSS here. The downside of this, obviously, is that it's page specific, so you would need to copy and change that on every single page that you're using if you're using it on multiple web pages. The normal, pretty standard one that we've been using is linking. So in here, we've got a link to a CSS document, which is saved in our site folder, and it is referenced up in Dreamweaver. So here, it's providing a link in our HTML document to a central file. The biggest perk of this is that we can have a whole bunch of different pages pointing to the same CSS file. So when we make changes to the CSS, it will be reflected on all of our pages. The only other form of CSS is remote CSS. Depending on your Bootstrap file, sometimes Bootstrap likes to work remotely. So rather than having your own local version of this Bootstrap CSS, your HTML might link to a hosted version of the Bootstrap CSS on the Bootstrap website. This is cool because you don't need to then host that on your site. That's one less file that you need to take care of. And it's going to auto-update. Rather than you making changes to the CSS, when Bootstrap, the organization, is going to update to the new version, your link is remotely going to update to point to the new one. So on to the Dreamweaver interface. You should be familiar with just kind of how the main Dreamweaver tool works, from changing our views from code view to split view to live view. You should know that live view is not exactly what we see here in split view. Live view has a few different functionalities that makes it a little bit more WYSIWYG, which is what you see is what you get, in that we can control this interface by selecting and dragging and dropping things. But we primarily worked in split interface, where we could see both the mock-up of the design, the preview, and our code at the same time. You should be familiar with managing sites, what it means to have a managed site, which is basically telling Dreamweaver where all of your files are in Finder or in Windows Explorer, so that It can keep track of how all of the files relate to each other. It can keep all of the links between the files to be relative, which means that they are pointing to a location within this folder and not looking on the root of your computer, which would not work if you are changing this, sending it to somebody else and it's looking on your computer for the files. We want all of our links to be relative, and for that to happen, we need to have Dreamweaver managing our site folder. As long as you do that at the beginning of a project, everything is going to go pretty smooth. If something changes, you're able to change in Manage Sites. You're able to point to a different folder. You can make duplicates. But managing sites is how we tell Dreamweaver which project is which and which files go with which project. So it's very important to keep that organized and up to date. You should be familiar with the Insert menu. We use this to insert both HTML objects and Bootstrap components. So a lot of preset code that's ready to go, whether it's adding buttons, adding images, adding forms, all of it's going to come from here. And this is a huge resource so that you don't need to remember what all of this stuff is. You should be familiar with the CSS designer, which we used pretty regularly, and everything except the media section, which we did not touch in this course and will be covered more in web design too. But you should be familiar with creating new web CSS sources, with selecting between existing CSS sources, with creating new selectors, how if it is a predefined under global, see if I mouse over here, it says defined under global. If it is a global property, then it doesn't need a period. If it is a class that you are defining, then it does need to start with a period. And then once you've created your selector, you can then go and assign properties. You should know how to navigate this screen. You should know that turning on show set is going to only show you the predefined values versus all of the options that you could choose from. And you should be familiar with how to preview a file using the browser preview here. You should also be familiar with how to clean up and validate your code. So we went through a couple of different steps there that use some of the site tools that I'm now forgetting exactly which ones we did. But we want to, let me pull that up. Okay, so we're going to use the validator to do some error checking. So if you go to Window, Results, and then Validation, make sure this is on the right screen, and click Play for the current document, it's going to show you any and all errors. It might give you an error. Let's try that again. Super. So not working right now, but it should show you HTML errors that you would then go through by checking each line, things like spaces in your file names, capitals, special characters, non-closed tags, broken links, etc. We would also use the HTML cleanup tool. So tools, where is it? Clean up HTML, and this is going to just clean up all your code, indent everything properly, make it a lot easier to navigate. And then finally is the link checker, which is under site, site options, where are we going here? Site options, check links site-wide. Did they change it? Okay, so it's just going to make sure that all of our links are working and pointing to pages that exist. I've got a bunch of broken links in here that would need to be fixed. And aside from that, we would just make sure that you have your metadata in the top of the document and that your folder is cleaned up and ready to go. So aside from Dreamweaver, then next up is Bootstrap. And what is Bootstrap and why are we using it? Bootstrap is a front-end framework. It is a collection of production-ready HTML and CSS and JavaScript components that you can use in your designs. It includes a grid system, styles for typography, forms, buttons, a zillion components, same with JavaScript, and it is responsive for cross-browser consistency. It's free, it's modular, it's awesome. Bootstrap is one of many different front-end frameworks. It's one of the more popular ones. It's open sourced and it's free. It started as an internal project at Twitter, and then it got very, very popular, and it was opened up to be an open source project, meaning that anyone can use it for free. And it's updated pretty regularly, I think annually, and it's up to version 4.5 or so now. So it's always being improved. Bootstrap is great. As you should be aware of by now, it's a lot easier to use a whole bunch of pre-selected code of preset components and objects rather than like creating every single thing down to like a button from scratch. It's going to be automatically responsive, so we're going to spend more time in Web Design 2 talking about creating responsive designs that are styled to work on different screen sizes, but Bootstrap makes it really easy because it's very mobile friendly, it's very adaptable to different screen sizes just pretty automatically. And it's built into Dreamweaver, so it makes our lives really easy. You can download files individually from the website, but you can also just create new files with Bootstrap built in Dreamweaver, which means that it's going to create a structured page for you. It's going to create some automatic CSS and JavaScript ready to go, and it's just really easy. So you can see it comes with a bunch of stuff, some Bootstrap, CSS, some JavaScript, a bunch of things that just make the components work, like these buttons and carousels and drop downs and things that you would otherwise need to get individual plugins to make work. Also comes with a bunch of layout options, including a grid, a whole scaffolding system, a whole bunch of global styles, and then lots of content, typography, tables, cards, everything. Components are probably the best because there's just so many different objects that you can combine to make really anything. And in addition to being pretty customizable, there's a lot of different classes that you can employ that would change the state of a button, the light or darkness of a menu, things that you can do without actual CSS. On top of it, you can also create your own separate CSS that's going to override and make changes to the default CSS that comes with Bootstrap. So you can further customize it on your own, as we did with our websites. It also has a grid system that is based on a 12-column grid. And so we used a little bit of code to decide how many columns things are going to take up. If you want a 2-column approach, and also depending on screen sizes, a lot of this, again, is a bit more advanced, and we didn't touch on this too much. But we did some structure where we would create a container that would have a row that would have a grid within it. And then we gave those rows and grids classes. So it would say that if you wanted to have a 2-column grid, on a phone, it would be the class.call-xs-6. The important thing to remember here is just the 12-column grid, and so the number in these classes is divided by 12. So 6 divided by 12 is 2, so you have 2 columns in a grid. And then we structure it like this. There's a container, there's a row, and then there are columns within that row. And those columns are the ones that get the grid number class sizes here. All right, so that is Bootstrap. We also talked about saving files for the web. I don't have slides to share on these, but you should be familiar with some of the Photoshop aspects that we touched on in this course, but are a bit more covered in the Intro to Graphic Applications course. Pretty much just things like differentiating pixel count and file size and how to change them. We did our Save for Web exercise where we were able to control the pixel count, the compression level, and the file type in order to get the right kind of files that we needed. And being familiar with the different formats. So the main web ones are PNG, JPEGs, and GIFs. PNGs you use when you need transparency. They're the only things that, well, GIFs handle transparency a little bit, but generally you're using PNGs for transparency, JPEGs for photographs, and GIFs for flatter graphics. PNGs allow you to compress pretty simply with a small, medium, and large file. JPEGs allow you to choose compression on a scale of either 1 to 100 or 1 to 12. And GIFs compress by choosing the number of colors. Last but not least, want to do a quick refresher on how the modern internet works, because one of the last exercises we're going to do this coming week is how to upload your website to an actual server so that it's live on the internet. So far, everything that we've been doing, you've been previewing your website on your computer, which is great for working locally. It's fast, it's easy, but nobody else can see it. So for your website to really be done and live and a real website, it needs to go onto a web server. So we're going to review quickly just the concepts behind this so that our next exercise is clear. Remember that you access the internet through an internet service provider, and those internet service providers, among others, run big servers. Data is stored on the servers, like your websites will soon be stored, and then client devices like a laptop or a phone are going to access that server to view your website. It's going to have an IP address, and it's going to have a URL. The IP address is the computer address, the internet server, and the human-friendly URL is the domain name that you would purchase and set up through your web hosting server. So in this case, I'm setting up a web hosting server, and I'm providing you with access to it. But I have a domain name, I have a shared web host server, and we're going to use an FTP client to upload content to that server, so that when somebody goes to the browser URL, it's going to look up the IP address, and it's going to pull up the content from the DNS server, and it's going to display it on the browser with the code that you are writing in Dreamweaver now. So that's pretty much it for the review for the quiz. You're going to have 45 minutes on the quiz, and it's going to be 20 questions that are primarily multiple choice, matching true or false. It's going to be closed book, no applications open, especially not Dreamweaver. And along with uploading your final site to the server, finishing this exam is going to be the last assignment for the semester.